I mean, I've been researching the Black Dahlia case for many years. I was really, like a lot of people, I've been super obsessed with it and trying to find every piece of information I could find. But I was really more as kind of a passive hobbyist. Like I'd read every book, every article. And then a few years ago, I just decided, there's so much more information that hasn't been printed. What I'd like to do is just write it all down, write down every fact of the case and put everything to, not necessarily solve it, but just I want to know everything about this case. And so it was a big kind of organizational effort to, from lots of different sources. And again, a lot of information that had sort of been overlooked. And so one of the things I did was rather than arrive at who I think committed the murder, and then starting from there, it was I want to know about the victim. I want to know about Elizabeth Short, everything about her life, where she went, who she was in contact with, and especially who she was as a person. And I was able to put together a list of pretty much, the majority of the people who she interacted with in the 5 months before she was murdered. And I started looking into a lot of those names, and eventually it led to one person who was verified to have spent 3 days with her 1 month before she was murdered. And immediately after she spent these 3 days with him, she essentially escaped from Los Angeles and went to San Diego, which was a city she had never been to and knew nobody in. She arrived essentially homeless and penniless and told people that she had spoken to on the phone that she had escaped a screwball, which in the 1940s is a term for somebody who is not right in the head, right? There's something wrong with them. They're dangerous. I've got to get away from them. And then the police found out about this guy a few weeks after the murder, that this man who had spent 3 days with her, and thought we should look into this. And they interviewed him. They detected right away a bunch of lies in his witness statements, or in his statements, things that didn't track. They went out into Hollywood to verify whether what he said was correct, and it turned out there was a lot of misleads, a lot of things that were inaccurate, which kind of started to get their hair raised. And then they decided, okay, let's find out who this guy is who's being very deceptive with us. They looked into his past, and what they discovered was that, and again, this is LAPD's initial investigation, this is their work here, is they find out that this guy went to college in the late 1930s, mid to late 1930s, with a woman in Kansas City who in 1941, a couple of years after they graduated from college, was murdered in what was determined to be eerily similar circumstances to that of Elizabeth Short. There were certain things about the two murders that were very similar. And both women were suspected of having known this one man. But the LAPD was never able to ascertain definitively that he knew Lila Welsh in Kansas City, who again was killed 6 years before Elizabeth Short. And one of the reasons they couldn't is that KCPD, the Kansas City Police Department, would not send over the files, even though they kept promising, yeah, we're going to send over those files on the murder and this guy that you're looking into, no problem. And they just never did. And so the LAPD was a bit hobbled without the proper information on this murder. So flash forward decades later, I'm learning all this and reading about this. And I realized that nobody has done a deep dive into this guy and also into this Welsh murder and the possible connections with Elizabeth Short. And there were a few mentions online. Some people referred to Lila Welsh as the Kansas City Black Dahlia, and was there a connection? It had kind of bubbled up to the surface. People sensed that there was something to look into here, but nobody had done that kind of heavy research project. So I thought, I'll make this a part of my Black Dahlia research. And subsequently, not only did I discover that this suspect knew Lila Welsh, their lives intersected all the time in myriad ways. So their families, her boyfriend, lots and lots of different ways. They all were in the same small social group. He was essentially always in her, kind of on her periphery and watching her. And so I was able to establish that not only did they know each other, they knew each other for years. And then I began looking into the Lila Welsh murder itself. And what I discovered was that the LAPD was right. There were shocking similarities, but much more than LAPD was ever aware of. And the crossover between Welsh and Short's murders is shocking when you look at the list of details and the similarities, which are detailed in my book. it becomes sort of beyond coincidental. There is no way that these murders were committed by two different people, and all of these markings and mutilations and the draining of blood, that it was just a coincidence that they occurred 6 years apart. There's one man who knew both women and had the opportunity and the means and the methods to carry out these murders, and so I believe that he is responsible for both of them. I mean, it required going to Kansas City and a couple different small towns in Kansas, and going to the military records in St. Louis, and obviously across Los Angeles, Ventura and Santa Barbara County, Chicago, Boston. I mean, it was a true kind of cross-country research trip. And it was, it's a catch as catch can. I mean, you do everything. I'm sure there's plenty of documents out there that I never got to, I just never knew about. But I mean, it was just calling every historical society in Missouri and Los Angeles, and trying to get access to their basement vaults and boxes and stuff like that. But it was laborious. I mean, you've got to go through a lot of stuff to get there. Like, for instance, just as a small example, when the killer and Leela Welsh are going to college at University of Kansas City in the 1930s, I was able to get in touch with the resident historian and archivist at UMKC, a guy by the name of Chris Wolf, who's an amazing researcher and was likewise obsessed with the Leela Welsh case. And he had collected every single edition of the U News newspaper, which was the school newspaper at the time. So great. I'm going to see if I can find their names in here and find out what life was like in college for them. Well, it's not searchable. These are all just images. And so I had to read every edition, or I guess an edition, every issue of the U News from 1933 to 1939. This is, they printed this paper quite frequently, just searching for the names of people who might be associated or tangentially associated with the story. And I found a lot of stuff in there, but I mean, it's crazy. You're spending days reading a student newspaper from the 1930s. And I also believe that it's important to take a look, even when a story is goes cold, is to take a look at the individuals who were involved, whether they're suspects, whether they were convicted, whatever it might be, friends of the victim, is to look at what happened to them in the decades that followed, because there's certain behavioral patterns that sometimes evidence themselves 15, 20 years later, which happened a lot in the case of this book. And so you get, it's one of the gifts of looking back, sort of from a historical standpoint, is you get the gift of what, happened to them in the 30 or 40 years after the events, whereas the police at the time only have a snapshot of right now. So it was, there was a lot of behavior in the suspect, the killer, later on that actually reflected on the two murders, and was really important to sort of understanding who this person was. And then in terms of the dialogue, the majority of the dialogue that I write in the book is actually word for word what they said. And it's cobbled together from court transcripts and newspaper articles and, I mean, myriad other sources. I know that some authors sort of reconstruct dialogue, and and some of them are fabulous at it, and I have a lot of respect for that. But for me, especially with a murder case, I just feel like you have to be factual, and it's important not to sort of jump too many chasms and try to put threads together that don't fit. And so I try to use the parlance of the time and the way that people spoke. And the best way to do that is just to use their real words. And so, most of the dialogue is actually word for word what was spoken. There's a couple moments where it was described later on like, oh, the guy rushed in and was super excited. He had the piece of evidence. So you might write, Chief, I got it, just to make the point. It's no different than probably what he actually said. So, there's always a couple moments where you can sort of recreate it a little bit, but I think the vast majority of the dialogue in there is literally word for word what the individual said.